There are two immediate implications of this need to use a bad reputation as a means of enforcing chastity in women. The first is that sexual transgressions must be widely regarded as being particularly immoral, since the sentence must be both frequent and severe to be effective. The problem is heightened in Hume's view because he regards women as especially subject to temptation, and the pleasures of infidelity as especially tempting. According to Hume, the degree of shame attached to infidelity in women must thus be greater than that which arises from regard to its injustice. Hence, we have a part of the explanation as to why the obligation of women to be chaste is stronger than the obligation in men. The second implication, which Hume does not discuss, is that the bad reputation must attach to women on the basis of some publicly observable acts. Thus, chastity gets linked to that exterior modesty which we require in the expressions and dress and behavior of the fair sex. The bad reputation will then get attached to the immodest behavior. Although Hume regards threat of a bad reputation as a very strong motive to fidelity, he does not consider it sufficient, especially considering the strong temptation he thinks women have to conjugal infidelity. It is necessary to back up the punishment of a bad reputation by inculcating in women a preceding backwardness or dread which may prevent their first approaches, and may give the female sex a repugnance to all expressions and postures and liberties that have an immediate relation to that enjoyment. The link between exterior modesty and chastity is apparently found in these attitudes. Typically for Hume, we suppose a correlation between an unobservable motive, the object of our moral approbation or disapprobation, and publicly observable behavior. We take the motive to be the cause of the behavior. In the case of chastity, however, the behavior is typically unobserved. Hence, something must take place as the outward sign of the virtuous motive, and what takes its place must be appropriately connected to chastity. Modesty in dress and behavior is a public display of repugnance towards the erotic, and so has the right kind of relation both to chastity and to the virtuous motive. As the outward sign of a tendency towards chastity, modesty becomes a virtue in its own right because of the moral approbation that it elicits as the publicly available sign of a regard for chastity. This need to inculcate in women a repugnance towards anything sexual in order to compensate for the absence of legal enforcement also means that chastity must be extended beyond its original purpose to include abstention from non-marital sex among those women who are past their childbearing years. Internal modesty must overcome a perfectly natural temptation, and, given the strength of the temptation, it must be incompatible with any easy enjoyment of sexual pleasure. The extension of chastity to cover a woman's lifetime is thus a natural result of the inculcation of modesty. In his discussion of why chastity and modesty are extended to women beyond childbearing years, Hume suggests in the treatise that the extension of the rule is due to the association of ideas. He means here that the association of ideas in the minds of men, as he puts it, bachelors, however debauched, cannot choose but to be shocked by any instance of lewdness or impudence in women. But it would be much more to the point to note that women who have the appropriate attitudes will not suddenly cease to have them at menopause. In order for internalized modesty to provide the requisite assurance of chastity, it must be so deeply ingrained that we can count on most women not being able to overcome it. Men must be able to regard appropriately modest women as safe from the temptations to sexual pleasure. Hume's explanation in the second enquiry addresses this point more directly. The old would set a bad example for the young, and women, continually foreseeing a certain time would bring them the liberty of indulgence, would naturally advance that period and think more lightly of this whole duty, so requisite to society. He might have added that men, seeing that women can cease to be modest and chaste, might well worry that their wives can too easily abandon virtue for the temptations of sexual pleasure. If chastity and modesty do not cover a woman's lifetime, they cease to have an intimate connection with her attitudes towards her sexuality. The account that Hume gives of how the conventions of female chastity and modesty might arise is not atypical. It is a general feature of Hume's theory that threat of a bad reputation and the inculcation of proper attitudes serve directly to motivate the observance of artificial virtues. What is perhaps atypical is the lack of evidence for unchaste behavior, and hence the need to attach disapprobation beyond what justice calls for, and the need to attach a bad reputation on the basis of publicly observable behavior, modesty, different from the desired behavior, chastity. But even here, given the private nature of sexual transgression, Hume's account seems entirely in line with his general approach. In the absence of a judicial system providing public declarations of guilt and innocence on such issues as honesty, we should expect to find some publicly observable behavior serving as the determinant of a person's character. A woman's reputation for chastity based on her public display of modest behavior is akin to Abe Lincoln's reputation for honesty based on his return of a penny. Property in a small but easily observed dealing marks one as an honest man and becomes the hallmark of virtue. Section 3. Why chastity and modesty are artificial virtues. Once we understand how conventions of female chastity and modesty arise, we can see why they require consistency throughout a population, i.e., their usefulness depends on the existence of a convention. I will treat chastity and modesty separately and argue that each requires consistency throughout a population in order to be useful. The point of chastity is its role in a general convention of child rearing, which requires that children be born within the confines of monogamous marriages. Thus, its point is to ensure that children are appropriately raised. The conventions of chastity and modesty are thus generally useful in promoting social stability and the regular descent of property. But only a widespread convention of chastity will serve to achieve this goal. Single instances of chastity, though they may benefit particular individuals, need not generally promote the good. A single chaste woman will at best provide her own husband with assurance of paternity, and at best will ensure that her own children are properly raised. If the point of chastity were only to provide men with a feeling of security, then single instances would indeed accomplish that purpose when men have the requisite assurances. But the security of men is in turn only instrumentally valuable, and there is no reason to think that Hume takes it to be in itself of more importance than women's sexual freedom. Were we to balance the security of an individual man against the constraints imposed on an individual woman, it is not credible to suppose that our sympathies must be with the man. The case is surely much like one of Hume's main examples of an artificial virtue not being useful in the single instance. He notes that a judge must sometimes take money from a poor man and return it to a rich man. If we considered this case in isolation, it would not produce moral approbation because, while the rich man no doubt benefits from such a transaction, the balance of good is less than if the poor man were to retain the money. The case is similar for chastity. Indeed, outside the consideration of the children, little weight would seem to attach to a man's feeling for security over and above the natural love and affection which binds both partners equally to the marriage bed. Nor can we appeal to the raising of children to show that chastity must always be useful in the single instance, since experience tells us that even the best show of conjugal fidelity will not always ensure that a man is willing to raise his children. The fact that merit continues to be attached to chastity in such cases shows that our approbation does not depend on its usefulness in the single case. The universal approbation attached to chastity, like the universal approbation attached to respect for property, is only explicable with reference to general convention. Our moral approbation is aroused in individual instances by the chaste woman because we recognize the role that her chaste behavior plays in promoting the general social good. Only if we believe that the point of chastity is male assurance will we be tempted to regard it as useful in every single instance. Showing the conventional nature of chastity is sufficient to show the conventional nature of the combined virtues of chastity and modesty, since modesty is the outward sign of chastity and hence depends on the same convention as chastity. But there are additional epistemological reasons why we might think that modesty on its own requires consistency throughout a population. For chastity and modesty to play their role in the orderly production and maintenance of children, it is not sufficient that a man's wife actually be faithful. Men will participate in child-rearing within the traditional family structure only when they have assurance that their children are their own. Hence, men require not merely chastity from their wives, but assurance of chastity. But as the above discussion makes clear, the actual fact of chastity will not provide such an assurance, given the private nature of sexual transgressions. External modesty is the public sign of chaste behavior, but its functioning as a public sign must presuppose a context of regular behavior. There is no a priori connection between a set of manners and mode of dress and chastity. A man who had the only modest wife would have no reason to connect that modesty with the desired chaste behavior, and so would lack the requisite assurance. It is the general functioning of a convention in which chastity and modesty are connected that provides the regularity that allows us to take modesty as a sign of chastity. The beneficial effects of modesty, namely male assurance, arises from the existence of the general practice, not from the acts considered in isolation. The threat of a bad reputation as a sanction for unchaste and immodest behavior also seems to require the existence of a convention. Bad reputations only work when those who are branded with the reputation can be isolated from the reputable group and denied its benefits. Those tactics will only work when the disreputable group is relatively small. When the practice of modesty is widespread, it will have a tendency to sustain itself. Modest women are likely to disapprove of transgressions in others, and the more widely disapproval is found, the more effective the threat of bad reputation in producing modest behavior. Chastity and modesty do have, then, one of the identifying characteristics of an artificial virtue. The beneficial effect of the behavior depends on the existence of a general practice. Annette Bayer, however, has suggested that the double standard for chastity implies the consistency of chaste behavior is not required throughout a population, since Hume must assume that there will be a class of women who are immodest and unchaste with whom men can have illicit sex. The existence of such a class of women, Bayer argues, will not only diminish the point of fidelity for virtuous women, but will aid them in their attempts to be faithful by directing men's illicit sexual impulses elsewhere. That the double standard implies the existence of such a class of women is worth noting, and Hume should probably worry about what to say of men who are complicitous in the unchaste behavior of such women. But the existence of such a class of women does not show the consistency is not required throughout a population. To say that consistency is required is to say only that the behavior which elicits our moral approbation is only useful when considered in the context of a general convention that makes such behavior widespread. There is no indication that, in general, conventions will be universally observed. The convention of chastity and modesty may be useful despite the existence of some women who are immodest and unchaste, just as the convention of property is useful despite the existence of some people who are thieves. Nor does the existence of chastity and modesty in itself require such a class of women. Chastity and modesty are virtues because they elicit our moral approbation, because we perceive the public usefulness of such a convention. The convention is useful whether or not there exists a class of women who are not chaste and modest. It is the double standard rather than the female virtues that requires such a class of women, and the lesser obligation of men does not affect whether chastity and modesty are themselves conventional. The existence of a double standard, however, may affect whether we describe the virtues of chastity and modesty as typical, and I return later to the question of gender asymmetry. Chastity and modesty do, then, have the first of the features which identify an artificial virtue. The second identifying feature is that the natural motive which explains the behavior is self-interest, and the virtuous motive which elicits moral approbation is itself artificial. Chastity and modesty are clearly in the immediate self-interest of women. Immodest women will be unmarriageable. Men want to marry women they can trust not to make cuckolds out of them, and modesty provides the basis for that trust. Provided that women have no other attractive options for supporting themselves and their children, marriageability easily accounts for why individual women will find it rational to be modest, and why they will teach their daughters to be modest. But although this explanation can account for why individual women conform to the convention, it does not explain the existence of the convention in the first place. Hume's self-described task in the section on chastity and modesty is to explain these virtues in terms of the general interests of society, and that will require explaining why it is in the self-interest of everyone that there be such a convention. But the explanation has already been given. It is in the interest of all that there be some orderly means of securing the conditions for raising children.